Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Boss Economics World, the only show that takes the dismal science of economics and turns it into a full-blown tragicomedy. I'm your host, the one, the only, the guy who's been yelling at central bankers, tariff tantrums, and debt ceilings since before it was cool, yours truly, the boss economist. Today, we're diving headfirst into the economic circus that is Jackson Hole 2025, where the air is thin, the mountains are hazy, and the economic forecasts are hazier. Buckle up, folks, because this is going to be a wild ride through inflation, tariffs, immigration, and oh yeah, a debt-to-GDP ratio that's basically screaming, hold my beer. Let's get into it. So, picture this, it's August 26, 2025, and Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, our fearless monetary maestro, is stepping out for a photo op at the annual Jackson Hole Economic Symposium. Behind him, the majestic Wyoming mountains are shrouded in a tinge of haze. Haze, people. If that's not the most poetic metaphor for the state of the global economy, I don't know what is. We've got inflation running hotter than a TikTok dance trend, a labor market that's starting to look like it's on life support, and a policy landscape so uncertain it makes a magic 8-ball look like a crystal ball. And what does Powell do? He steps up to the podium, adjusts his tie, and basically says, yeah, folks, we're flying blind here, but hey, at least the mountains look pretty. Now, let's break this down, shall we? Because behind the haze, there's a whole lot of economic chaos brewing, and it's not just the US that's feeling the heat. From Trump's tariff tantrums to immigration crackdowns, from debt-to-GDP ratios that sound like science fiction to central bankers bickering like reality TV stars, this is the economic equivalent of a 5-car pileup on the information superhighway. So, grab your popcorn, folks, because we're about to dissect this mess from point to surface, Boss Economics World style. Let's start with the elephant in the room, or should I say, the tariff-happy elephant in the White House. Powell, in his final keynote address as Fed chair, dropped a truth bomb: President Trump's tariff hikes are remaking the global trading system. Now, when a central banker uses air quotes like that, you know it's bad. And folks, it is bad. Trump's tariffs, slapped on everything from Chinese electronics to Canadian lumber, are like throwing a Molotov cocktail into the delicate machinery of global trade. Sure, the idea was to bring jobs back home and stick it to the globalists, but the reality? Higher prices, disrupted supply chains, and a whole lot of economic collateral damage. Let's talk numbers, shall we? According to a 2024 report from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, Trump's tariffs have already cost U.S. consumers an estimated $50 billion annually in higher prices. And that's before the latest round of hikes in 2025, which slapped an additional 25% tariff on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. Meanwhile, the World Trade Organization reported that global trade growth slowed to just 1.2% in 2024, down from 3.5% pre-tariff tantrum. Coincidence? I think not. And here's the kicker, a 2025 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that for every job saved by tariffs in protected industries, 3 jobs were lost in downstream industries due to higher input costs. 3 to 1, folks. That's not winning, that's economic Darwinism. So, what does this mean for the average Joe and Jane? Higher prices at Walmart, fewer jobs in manufacturing, and a global trading system that's starting to look like a game of Jenga played by drunk toddlers. And here's the real punchline, Powell says these tariffs are contributing to inflation that's still above the Fed's 2% target. Gee, you think? When you jack up the cost of imports, prices go up. It's not rocket science, folks, it's economics 101. But wait, there's more. Powell also pointed to Trump's immigration crackdown as creating what he called a curious kind of balance. Translation, we've got a labor market that's slowing down on both the supply and demand side. Now, let's unpack this, because it's a doozy. On one hand, Trump's policies, think border walls, deportations, and visa restrictions, have slashed the supply of immigrant workers. According to the Migration Policy Institute, net immigration to the U.S. dropped by 40% between 2020 and 2024, and it's only gotten worse in 2025. On the other hand, businesses are hiring less because, surprise, tariffs and uncertainty are making them nervous. The result? A labor market that's starting to look like a ghost town. Now, let's talk about why this matters. Immigrants, documented or otherwise, have been a key driver of U.S. economic growth for decades. A 2023 report from the Congressional Budget Office found that immigrants contribute to 25% of U.S. GDP growth annually, either through labor, entrepreneurship, or consumer spending. But with fewer workers coming in, industries like agriculture, construction, and hospitality are screaming for help. Just last month, the National Federation of Independent Business reported that 60% of small businesses couldn't fill open positions, up from 45% in 2023. And here's the kicker, wages are rising, but not because of some glorious economic boom. Nope, it's because employers are desperate to fill gaps, which ding feeds right back into inflation. So, what's the takeaway here? Trump's immigration crackdown might play well with his base, but economically, it's like shooting yourself in the foot and then complaining that you can't run a marathon. And Powell's curious kind of balance? It's not balance, folks, it's stagnation. A labor market where supply and demand are both shrinking is not a recipe for growth. It's a recipe for a big, fat nothing burger. Now, let's move on to the part of the show where we talk about numbers so big, they sound like they belong in a sci-fi movie. At Jackson Hole, a group of economists dropped a bombshell of a paper, claiming the US could sustain a debt-to-GDP ratio of, wait for it, 250% without putting pressure on interest rates. 250%, folks. For context, the Congressional Budget Office says we're already on track to hit 107% by 2029, which would break the post-World War II record. But 250%? That's not just breaking records, that's yeeting them into outer space. Now, before you start panicking, or worse, celebrating, let's dig into what these economists are actually saying. Their argument is that the US can keep borrowing like there's no tomorrow because global demand for US treasuries is so strong, it keeps interest rates low. And hey, they've got a point, sort of. According to the International Monetary Fund, foreign investors held $8.5 trillion in US treasuries as of mid-2025, up from $7.5 trillion in 2023. That's a lot of faith in Uncle Sam's IOUs. But here's the catch, the economists also say that to sustain this debt bonanza, the US would need a fiscal adjustment of 10% of GDP or more. Translation, massive tax hikes, spending cuts, or both. And folks, when was the last time Congress agreed on anything, let alone a fiscal adjustment that big? I'll wait. Here's the real kicker, the longer we delay this adjustment, the more likely it is that debt supply outstrips demand, forcing interest rates to spike. And when interest rates spike, guess what happens? Higher borrowing costs, slower growth, and yep, you guessed it, more inflation. It's like a fiscal time bomb, and the clock is ticking. Just look at Japan, which has a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 260% as of 2025. Sure, they've kept interest rates low, but at what cost? Stagnant growth, an aging population, and a central bank that's basically become a glorified debt-buying machine. Is that the future we want for the US? Because I'm pretty sure Japanification isn't on anyone's economic bingo card. Speaking of inflation, let's talk about the Fed's other headache. Powell and his crew are grappling with inflation that's still above their 2% target and rising. According to the latest forecasts, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, PC, excluding food and energy, the Fed's favorite inflation gauge, hit 2.9% in July 2025, the fastest annual pace in 5 months. And on a monthly basis, it's climbing at 0.3% for the second month in a row. Meanwhile, household spending is surging, with the biggest advance since March. Sounds great, right? Wrong. Because all that spending is fueling inflation, and the labor market is starting to crack under the pressure. Now, here's where it gets juicy. Powell signaled at Jackson Hole that he's open to cutting rates at the Fed's September meeting. But not everyone's on board. 2 governors already dissented at the July meeting, arguing against rate cuts. And if the Fed does cut rates next month, we might see dissent in the opposite direction, with hawks crying foul over inflation risks. It's like watching a reality TV show, except instead of drama over who gets the rose, it's drama over who gets to tank the economy. Let's be real, folks, the Fed is stuck between a rock and a hard place. Cut rates too soon, and you risk runaway inflation. Wait too long, and you risk a recession. And with Trump's tariffs and immigration policies throwing wrenches into the mix, it's no wonder Chicago Fed President Austin Goolsbee called this a difficult environment. Difficult? Austin, my man, this isn't difficult, this is economic Hunger Games. So, what's the takeaway from all this, folks? The global economy in 2025 is a hot mess, and the US is leading the charge. Trump's tariffs are jacking up prices and slowing trade. His immigration crackdowns are starving the labor market. The debt-to-GDP ratio is climbing into the stratosphere, and the Fed is stuck playing whack-a-mole with inflation and unemployment. And through it all, there's one word that keeps popping up, uncertainty. Uncertainty about trade policy, uncertainty about fiscal policy, uncertainty about monetary policy. It's like the economic equivalent of a choose-your-own-adventure book, except all the endings are bad. But hey, it's not all doom and gloom. At least we've got Boss Economics World to make sense of the madness, right? So, whether you're an average Joe worried about your grocery bill or a Wall Street hotshot sweating over your bond portfolio, remember this, the economy might be a circus, but we're the ringmasters. Until next time, keep your wallets close and your central bankers closer. This is the Boss Economist, signing off.